Hi everyone, it's Lisa here. I'm back today with a project for you, and I'm going to be creating a card doing some simple Copic colouring, and I'm going to create a background using the range of Distress Oxide ink. So I'm going to be doing some ink blending as well. I'm using one of my favourite florals from Clearly Besotted called Happily Ever After. So here's the set that I'm going to be using, this beautiful floral image, and I'm going to be taking my sentiment from another Clearly Besotted set called Simply the Best. I've started off by stamping the main image using Memento Tuxedo Black onto some Nina 80-pound cardstock, and I'm going to start by colouring the leaves. The colours of my Copics are shown there, but I will also put a caption up on the screen. I'm starting off with my darkest colour, which is BG23. I'm adding a little bit of that to the outside of the leaf. I then go in with BG11 and blend that out slightly, and then I add my lightest colour, which is BG000. So for that leaf I went darkest to lightest, and as you can see you still do get a really nice blend with that. But for my next leaf I'm actually going to go light to dark instead. Starting off with BG000 here, and I'm using that and filling in all of these leaf images. I'm then going to take BG11 and I'm just going to add a little bit more detail around the edge of each leaf with that. And then I finally take the BG23, which is my darkest shade, and I add a few little shadows along the edge of the leaves with that colour as well. And I'm just going to blend that out slightly now with my BG11, just so that I don't get any harsh lines, and you can still see that I do have a highlight there as well. The end result, whichever way you do it, looks pretty much the same, but I do tend to find when colouring small images that I prefer to go from dark to light, because that way you don't oversaturate the cardstock and end up with getting some bleeding outside of your images. I've finished colouring the leaves and I'm going to move on to the main part of the floral image now, and I've got four colours here. They're kind of a corally red palette, and I mostly am just using R22, R02 and R11 in that order. So I'm starting with my darkest, which is R22, blending it out with R02, and then my lightest colour is R11, and I'm just adding that onto the edge of R02 and blending that out, leaving a little bit of a white highlight at the end. I'm going to carry on colouring the petals now in the same order as the first one, and as you can see here I'm only using 3 of the colours at this stage. I don't use the R24 just yet. You'll see that I add that in a little bit later just to add a little bit more depth to each of those petals. I should also say at this point I really am not a Copic colouring expert. I have taken some classes which I really enjoyed, and I do mostly just practice and play around with them. There are some brilliant Copic colourists out there. I'm just showing you an easy way of blending for my image today. This doesn't require huge amounts of markers, and I think, or I hope, that you'll agree that you can end up with a really good blend and a really pretty image even if you only have limited colours. You can see here the colouring areas of this part of the floral image are actually quite small. I'm still managing to leave a little white highlight at the end, but it is a bit more tricky to do that on the smaller areas. I'm now going in with a little bit of R24. This is my darkest shade, and I'm not going to add it into every kind of nook and cranny that there is. I just pick selected parts of the image, and I'm just going to add a little bit of that colour in there to add a bit more shading and dimension. And then I take my R22 and I blend that out just so that it doesn't come across as a harsh line. But you can actually do this at the beginning. You could have started with your R24, then used R22 and blended out its set etc. But I prefer to add my really dark colour in at the end, just because I don't want to use it on every single petal. I only just pick selected areas for it. I'm going to carry on colouring the image in now, and whilst I'm doing that I'm just going to talk a bit about how I selected the colours for this image. They were actually based on the colours of oxides that I chose for my background. I wanted to have a coral and kind of honey coloured or yellow honey coloured background, and so I took the hex chart, which you can get from Sandy Allnock's website, and I'll link to that below. It's a really useful way of documenting what colours you own and what colour markers go really well together. And so once I'd chosen my inks for my background, I then picked up my hex chart and I went ahead and looked at the markers that I have got in my armoury, and I went ahead and chose a palette that I thought would go well with those oxide colours. I don't own all the Copic markers. I have probably just over half of them at this stage, but I'd certainly had enough to match up with the oxide colours, and that's how I went about choosing which ones to use. I'm almost at the end now of colouring that flower. I'm just adding a little bit more of the R24 into certain parts of the image just to help those areas pop a little bit. I really do think that it makes a difference putting that final dark colour in. And I went ahead and finished the colouring off camera, and I'm now going to fussy cut the image. You can get a coordinating die for this, but I don't have it. And I did think it's actually not a bad image at all to fussy cut out, particularly as I wasn't worried about cutting the inner parts of the image, because that part of my background is actually going to be white anyway, so it wasn't really necessary to cut those smaller sections out from the middle. And once I've finished fussy cutting this image out, I'm then going to start and work on the other elements of my card. I did notice that once I'd cut it out, I had a few areas where I'd gone over the edges slightly. So I took the colourless blender and I just erased some of that ink that had gone outside of the lines. Time for me to work on my background now. I've taken an A2 panel of Nina cardstock. This is £80, and I'm taking Abandoned Coral Distress Oxide, and I'm going to blend that into the bottom right hand corner of that cardstock, and I tap off the excess before I bring the blending tool over onto my cardstock. And I do really find that the Tim Holtz medium matte is great for blending because it's a glass matte. It really does help you move that tool over the area and smoothly onto your cardstock. But it is a process when you blend. You have to build up the layers. At the moment you can see it looks quite splotchy, and that's even with the oxides, which are a smoother ink in general to blend than the Distress inks. But as you build up the layers, you do lose that splotchiness. I'm now moving on to the other corner, and I'm using Wild Honey Oxide for this corner, and I'm not going to bring the colour as far down the panel. I'm doing the same as before, tapping off the excess before I bring it over to my panel. And I'm just seeing there how my image looks, and I didn't really feel that I'd put the abandoned coral far enough across at the bottom, and it still needed a little bit more work, so I added a bit more colour to that section. And then I took Candied Apple Oxide and I just used a tiny bit of that to add a little bit more depth to the bottom right of the panel. It's hard to see on camera, but you can see it in real life. I've added some foam tape to the back of my image, and I'm just removing that and I'll set it to one side. I've also added some double-sided tape to the back of my blended panel, so I'm now going to remove that and I'm going to adhere that down onto an A2 top folding base card. This is Nina £110. I always use that for my base cards. Apologies for my head there. I'm just making sure that I line that up properly. So I'm just pushing that down and then I'm going to pop my floral image on top, and you can see that even though the blending looks a little bit uneven at the edges, when you put your image down over the top you really don't see that at all. Working now on my sentiment, I've taken some black cardstock and the sentiment from Clearly Besotted, Simply the Best. I'm going to add some anti-static powder onto my cardstock, and then I'm going to heat emboss this with white embossing powder. I don't show all of that, I just take it and do it off camera, and then I'm going to die cut it out with a Simon Says Stamp sentiment label die. I absolutely love these dies. They make cutting out sentiments so much easier. I always had a tendency to make mine a little bit wonky, but it does really help having these dies. And so I've die cut that out into a thin strip, and I've popped some foam tape on the back, and I'm just going to position that over the top of the image. And to finish my card off, I add some ice crystal sequins from Lucy's cards, just positioned them around the image. You can see them there as my little bit of sparkle that I can never seem to do without. And that brings you to the end of the card for today. I hope that you found that useful and that you enjoyed the video, and if so, please do give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel, and I'll be back with another project for you soon. Thank you so much for watching.